Okay, I've got a thing saying live.
You should be live. Hello, everyone.
Hello, welcome to the UN Millennium Campaign's first inaugural Google Hangout. We have Claire Melamed of the IAG on the data revolution for the SDGs. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. This is my first Google Hangout as well, so...
Exactly, so yes, we can make mistakes together, it seems. So yeah, the purpose of this Hangout is two-part, of course. We've recently launched on The World We Want, a consultation, online consultation on the data revolution. It's currently focusing on the human rights issue around the data revolution. And we are lucky to have Claire here today to answer a few questions that were produced in part with UNICEF colleagues. So Claire, if I can kick off. May I ask you a few questions to get the ball rolling?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So first of all, this is quite a general question, but in your opinion, what recommendation should the SG's Independent Expert Advisory Group on the Data Revolution for the SDGs make to reconcile the dilemma on the right to participation and the right to privacy?
I think this is a really difficult question. This has been one of the things that has been one of the sort of recurrent themes in the conversations on the group, because there are two things, as you suggest by the question, which are somewhat contradictory. The right to privacy, the right of people not to have their data shared if they don't want to, the right to remain anonymous, the right to not have the, sometimes quite intrusive questions that surveys and other things ask be splashed all over the world, and that is a right which is only becoming more acute with some of the new data sources that we've been looking at through the work of the group, with the ability to take information from people without them even knowing about it. So, the way that we can track people's movements through their mobile phones and things like that make this right to privacy all the more acute. On the other hand, we have very good arguments in favour of open data, of the importance of making as much information as possible public, transparent, open, understand the basis behind decision making so that people can have, when it comes to accountability, and as big, as the sort of world of big data moves from kind of science fiction to reality, we're having more and more data on people, and it's more and more granular. It's easier and easier to identify individual people in the data that we have, and this contradiction between open data, the right to privacy, and the right to know, if you like, is becoming ever more difficult, and we don't really have an answer to that yet. One of the things that we're hoping to do, though, is to start a process that can really help to put these two worlds together and start to think what would be a compromise between those two things that would work in terms of keeping information open but not exposing people to sometimes quite dangerous situations.
Indeed, thank you. You mentioned I suppose inclusivity and participation are key elements here, and very important, of course, for the data to have effect and to be relevant. And I think that leads me on to my next question, which is about how data can actually support participation and provide that voice. And also, to build on that, I think you mentioned granular data. How to source that data, a method, what mechanism. Do we focus more on the demand element or the supply element?
Okay, well, there's quite a lot of questions there. Let me try and take them one at a time. How can data support participation? I think data can support participation in several ways. First of all, of course, participation is easier if, and more useful on all sides, if people have access to data. So people can be more effective in getting their views across, in explaining what it is they mean, in suggesting to policymakers what it is they want, the more information that they have. So, yeah, an example of where people's participation is more effective, and then in terms of getting them through them having more information. Secondly, of course, it's really important to have data to support not just participation in policy making, but the kind of the sort of participation to make their case, but then see what happened next, and the sort of data that allows you to track where the money is going, whether things are getting better in terms of health outcomes or kids going to school or whatever the participation, the kind of particular, and just as it is part of the fabric, think of the whole of people want. So in terms of how to source it, so data is a whole range of different, sort of technocratic specialist methods around censuses and household surveys of different kinds, and the governments and their statistical offices have been quite important players in producing information. But more and more, that information is being produced by a much bigger range of institutions and people. So the private sector is producing a whole lot of information through big data, just through picking up what people call the sort of digital breadcrumbs that people drop as they go about their lives. Citizens groups, NGOs, and others are producing much more of their own data on what people want. Obviously, the My World project is a great example of this, of people producing their own data on what it is they want, what it is they need, and using that for influence and advocacy. And then companies, other kinds of companies are producing data on what they're selling, what they're buying. There's a whole plethora of data sources now. So where data comes from is a much more complicated question. And involved in that, there's a lot of trade-offs. So, there's a sort of quality issue. Data that is produced according to recognized methodologies, statistical techniques, you can be fairly sure that it's representative of whoever it is it's saying it's representative of. You can be pretty sure that the questions were asked in a not too leading way, so that if you're doing a survey, the answers that you get are as close as possible to what people actually think. And of course, if you're having data from lots of different sources, it's harder and harder to check really what is that data telling you. Is it representative of everybody, or is it just a few people that have answered a question and we're saying that that's the whole population? Maybe it isn't. So the kind of questions around quality of data become harder and harder the more different sources of data there are. That's not to say that we shouldn't use all these sources, we should, but we just it requires all of us, I think, to think a bit harder about what are the numbers actually telling us, how reliable they are, who produced them and why. To think really, I suppose, about two issues, about the quality of data in a methodological sense and around the politics of data's production. Who is it that's produced that data, and why did they do that? Do they have a particular interest in mind?
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting points there, especially with regard to how access is very important. And I think what we're touching on is that data, of course, is becoming more relevant, not just in terms of our work with the UN, but of course across society in general. With growth and involvement from both government, both the private sector, civil society, and I think that leads me on to my next question, which is to make data both relevant and representative, and also at the same time to ensure access. How do you feel that the data revolution in general can provide for that access, create access to data, and allow for citizen involvement, while at the same time ensuring that it does not become exploitation?
Okay, again, I think there's a lot of different. I think that First of all, I think the data revolution is building on a huge amount of really important campaigning and advocacy and technical work that has been done over decades in the area of open data and data access. And some of the people on the experts group have had decades of experience of doing this very thing. So we're absolutely not starting from scratch, and we're learning from a lot of really important work that's been done along the way. I think the first thing about access is simply changing the norms and the politics around data to make openness the norm. Why is it that we don't just assume that all data should be shared unless there's a really good reason not to? We tend to start from the opposite view, that generally people, or at least in the past, the norm has been that data will probably not be shared unless there's a really good reason to share it. And then we are gradually moving from one to the other, where more and more governments, companies, big institutions are starting to try much harder to share the data that they have. So I think we're partly a sort of change in norm. But I think there's this issue about exploitation, and I think just throwing a massive amount of spreadsheets into a website, you present things site and kind of things in a really complicated way, and it's actually in the sense of doing what you want openness to do, which is actually giving people more access to information. And there's quite a useful distinction here that comes out at various points in this discussion between data, which can be just rows of numbers, and information, which is actually those numbers processed into telling people something about something that they want to know about. So I think in terms of making data open, we have to think really hard about how we present it, what people actually want to know, and how can we present it in a way that is most likely to give them that. Just think about open data from the point of view not of the people who are putting it online, but from the point of view of the people who you want to use it. Think about open data always from the user's point of view. And secondly, of course, a lot of people just don't have the tools to know what to do with this. So we need a big investment in data literacy, in actually, much better education in schools and giving people that they need to handle this, what some people call the data deluge, which is coming our way.
Thank you for that. That was very informative, and unfortunately you broke up a little bit there, so I missed a bit of the middle part of your statement there. But I think I picked up on the fact that you were discussing that, what is the perception of open data, and that the fact that we should and need to break the current status quo on access, and I suppose that also is relevant to the use of data and the sharing of data. So I think this leads on to my probably last question, given your very generous amount of time that you've given us. But I would close on asking about specifically local accountability in terms of data, and how can we break the current status quo, the current perception on data, big data, and its use for participation, especially in governance, but of course in general as well. How can we also, in relation to that, how can we involve stakeholders, and how can stakeholders themselves encourage that the current status quo be broken, and that data can itself be more transparent and allow for better participation in governance and in policy making?
So I assume by that you're sort of, what do you mean by the current status quo? What do you think that is?
Well, if we're talking about a revolution, we're talking about data being more open, data sourcing being more efficient. I suppose in current society there's a little bit of reserve about how much data is there. It's two-part. It's both from the citizen perspective and from the government perspective. Maybe some institutions would see data as a potential liability.
Yeah.
And my question would be, how, both using stakeholders and mechanisms, how do we shift that? How do we change that?
Okay. I mean, I think sort of somewhat links back to what I was saying before. I think you have to start, one place to start, which seems to be where we are starting, is just changing the norms and expectations. And more people within organisations, as well as outside of organisations, expect data to be open access. So among academics, for example, there's more and more of an expectation that if you publish work involving data, you will also make the data set on which you base that work available publicly online. And if you don't, then your peers will say, well, why haven't you done that, and criticise you for it. And there's a sort of norm change which I think is happening, and more governments are under pressure by citizens to produce data online, to release it, and so on. I think possibly the area where we haven't quite got there yet is in the area of big data and the data which is generated and held by the private sector. Again, there have been progress in this, but I think we're far from seeing a world where all of this big data is made available for public analysis. There are two tricky issues there, I think, that would have to be resolved before we can really make that jump. The first is privacy, which we've discussed earlier. Some of this data is confidential and is things which, if got into the wrong hands, could actually cause harm to people. So there are really good, human sort of rights-based reasons to be careful about releasing some data. There is also issues around commercial confidentiality and sort of commercial interests, which, you have to address in some way in terms of creating the right incentives or regulatory framework or some combination of the two, so that companies again will release this data as the norm. And you have to set up those expectations in a way that allows that to happen from the point of view of privacy and from the point of view of the kind of big commercial interests at stake. So I think we seem to be on a sort of inevitable onward march toward open data, and I think that is really touching every institution, the sector, the private sector, academia, really, and where they through evaluations of their programs and so on. So I think this is to which people will be moving towards that final point at a slightly different pace, depending on a whole number of constraints that people face. But I think it's going to happen.
Great. Okay. Claire, thank you very much. This has been first, and I think this has been a success. Hopefully you will have gained a bit from this. We certainly have. So thank you very much for participating, and thank you very much for everyone who's been watching online. And indeed, we look forward, and best of luck with your meeting tomorrow, of course, and we look forward to the outcome in November.
Thank you very much. And also, let me just say, for people, if people want to continue to engage with the group, we have a website, undatarevolution.org, and there's an open space there where people can leave comments, send us documents, and so on. So we'd love to hear more from people on these issues, or anything else that you've got on your minds in relation to data and the issues that we're tackling.
Absolutely. And actually, on that note, I mean, if you would just if you could close by maybe perhaps letting people know if there's anything specifically that you would like in terms of a contribution from civil society, or in fact anyone, of course, who could be watching, that would be relevant to your meeting tomorrow, and of course to your report. Please let us know before you leave us.
Okay, we have, as you said, we have our meeting tomorrow, so we have got a first draft of the report that's been written that we're going to discuss tomorrow. Probably a little bit late to get too much input into that. I don't want people to waste their time when we're, you know, it's getting on towards the end of the afternoon here and we're starting at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. But what we're going to be doing after that is producing a second draft of the report following the meeting, and then we're going to put that draft online for a few days. It's only going to be quite a small window because we're under a very, very tight deadline for this report. We have to hand it over to the UN Secretary General on the 6th of November. So for a few days we will be putting the whole draft of the report online, and very, very keen to get as much comment, reaction to that as we possibly can in the time. So please look out for that. Maybe Shane, you could send out an email to the group of people who you invited to this call when to announce when it goes online and how long it will be up for, so people really have the maximum time that we're able to give them. And our apologies in advance for that not being as long as any of us would have liked, to really get deep into that draft and see what people think of it. That's going to be the next crucial moment when we really need to hear from people.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. I will definitely assist in any way possible, and we can coordinate on that. So yes, I know you have to run, but thank you very much to you, Claire, for taking your time to answer these questions, and thank you for all those who are watching. And hopefully this will be of some relevance and can supplement what your work is currently doing in the report. So thank you very much again, Claire.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye.
Bye.